also told me, he's like, Adam, if you save 10% of every paycheck you ever make, he's like, you will be a very wealthy man when you're my age. So I think it was like these subtle things that was just like these little almost habits and disciplines that he just kind of subtly talked about when we were out in the yard that I definitely remember them. There's not many things I remember when I was 12, 13, but I remember those.
So did you go to college, etc.? So you left school, you was into hockey up to 13. What stopped you? Did you stop at 13 and just get bored of it and discover?
Yeah, so hockey's kind of interesting. It's not like, I mean, you think of like these professional athletes when they're like go to college and whatever, and like that's when they really kind of hit their stride. Hockey's different. Hockey's weird in the sense that if you're really good at hockey, you leave home at 14 to go play professional hockey. So you start to go to the ranks. You'll move and get signed with the team, and you'll literally move to a family that you don't know, and you'll live with the family you don't know, and you'll still go to school and all that stuff. But you're basically a semi-pro hockey player from like 14 to 16. And then 16 to 18, if you're good and you've got what it takes, you basically go into like the lower pro ranks. And there's no college system for hockey. So it's like you're only hockey. There's no like college involved. So then you go to be pro at 18. So I just wasn't good enough at 13. So I got into like football and rugby and was quite good at football and rugby kind of in high school.
Football is in soccer football or
American football.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And this, I don't know, this is maybe irrelevant, but can you make good money at hockey in the Canadian leagues? Is it on the same par as what other sports are in the US? Or is
it's definitely, it definitely wouldn't be in the ranks of baseball, football, and
the top
basketball.
Basketball,
But if you're good, you're going to make $10 million a year kind of stuff.
All right. So it's still substantial.
It's just, you're not getting a $200 million contract to be a pitcher, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Cool. So where was next then? So you stopped at 13. What was 13 to 16 before you went and left school, etc.?
Yeah, so I think probably like I was. It's funny enough. I kind of, in some ways, I wish I grew up in Australia because my destiny with sports might have been different. But I was really good at rugby. That was kind of like I started playing in high school.
I thought you were Australian, didn't I? At first.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
so for some bizarre reason, then Sharon corrected me. Yeah.
So if I would have started playing rugby at 5, maybe my outcomes would have been different. But I was really good at rugby. So I played high school rugby, and then there's like a junior pro league that they had kind of as like a farm team for the Canadian national team that kind of came out. So I played that like just out of high school. But I'd say like the latter part of that 13 to 16 was mainly around football and rugby sports, and then just like trying to squeak it out with the grades to get into a decent university.
And so where did you end up then? And what did you study?
Yeah, so I think this is another big turning point in my life. So all of my friends that I kind of grew up with, well, there's a batch that didn't go to university. There's a batch that did. The batch that did, unlike the US, most people stay in the same city that they're at when they go to school in Canada. So everyone was going to the University of Calgary. It was like a marquee school. I actually put my head down that last couple of years to get good grades. And like, I wasn't really a big math guy, but I kind of math is what did me in. But long story short, I didn't get into University of Calgary. So I was super bummed. I'm like, okay, I kind of worked my ass off to get into university that I wanted to. And like, I'm not going to the one that all my buddies are and the one in my town. So I went to kind of a junior college for a couple of years, which was kind of depressing, honestly. It's like, anyway, it's like a scarlet letter a little bit. People know that it's like a shitty school. So I went to that. And then I ended up transferring to a university called the University of Lethbridge to do business. And it was, 2 or 3 hours away from where I grew up, kind of south part of Alberta. And didn't want to do it. I was bummed out about it. I was kicking dirt. I didn't care, but I was just like, I just need a piece of paper at this point. Like, this is kind of nonsense. But that fundamentally changed my life, that 2-year experience at University of Lethbridge. I ended up joining a bunch of business competitions and kind of went on like a traveling circuit. We went out to the East Coast of Canada and competed against like Harvard and stuff, but it was like these business case competitions. So I got accepted into this management school, which was kind of like a mini MBA. It was like an isolated group of like 20 people that they went through the same kind of course materials for a year. But yeah, anyway, long story short, that whole experience at university, especially that back 2 years, was just like, okay, I think I can make this business stuff happen. And that was pretty formative in terms of my life and experience for sure.
And then where were you on to from there?
So then, and this is kind of what led me to the US ultimately, but I've always kind of been a bit of an adventurous spirit. I went to Europe a little bit in the middle of university, went to like 15 countries in Europe for like 2 or 3 months. So I kind of was like trying to avoid real life as long as possible when I graduated university. So I had two options. When I was backpacking in Europe, I met a guy from Byron Bay, Australia, which is like a sleepy little like surfer town. So I was either going to go be a bartender in Byron Bay for a year or two, and who knows what the hell would happen from there. But another buddy of mine, ironically enough, was selling pest control door to door in Texas the summer before. And he made like 30 or 40 grand, which at that point, like $2,000 was rich back then. Like it was like, so I was just like, holy shit. Like, and I'm like, I've always been pretty outgoing. I'm like, I could probably sell. So I'm like, maybe I'll do that. So long story short, and I should also say there's like a Mormon thread that we'll kind of get into throughout my life, which is kind of ironic, but University of Lethbridge is, there was like a Mormon temple outside of the town where I went to college. So a lot of Mormons went to school where I went to school. And a popular thing, I don't know if you know like Mormonism, but when you turn 18 as a guy, you basically go on a mission for 2 years and you go knock doors and sell religion for 2 years. Then you come back and kind of live your life. But a lot of them, when they come back from their mission to make money, they go sell pest control, they sell security systems, they do all this stuff door to door. Because like, shit, if you can try to sell religion door to door in Mexico, you can do pretty good.
You can sell anything.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, there was all these like Mormon dudes that were selling pest control. My buddy wasn't Mormon. He's like, yeah, man, I went down to Dallas last year and made like 40 grand. And so I was like toying between what I went to. I'm like, well, shit, I'll do that because I don't want real life to start. So I moved down to Texas and sold pest control door to door for 4 or 5 months. I thought that pulling nails out of a pallet was the worst job I'd ever had. That was probably the worst job I ever had. I mean, it's like, for context, it's like 40 degrees Celsius, humid as hell. Like I didn't have air conditioning in my car. I had like an old Cavalier I drove down to Texas. So anyway, I learned a lot about kind of resiliency there, but ultimately I met my now wife in Texas when I was there. So, you know, you're out as a young dude, you're out kind of in the scene. So I met my now wife. I moved back to Canada because of visa stuff. You can't legally stay for a certain amount of time in the US. I went back to Canada, ended up getting a job with a company that made like composite utility poles. So it was like on the energy side of things. And kind of another formative period, I would say too. I was pretty, I would say I was pretty ballsy in certain, maybe door knocking kind of turned this into me. But I had a group of buddies that I grew up with. Most of them became engineers in the oil field, so like drilling oil. But all of us were kind of like realizing even then that like regular career life probably isn't for us. So I had a bunch of guys that we'd kind of meet on Saturdays and talk business. But I ended up getting this job. And I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. I'm just going to like email the CEO. It's a pretty small company, but it's publicly traded. I'm just going to like email this dude. So I emailed him. I'm like, hey man, I'd love to hear your story. I just want to like introduce myself. And like, this is going like 3 rungs above where I should. So I went into this guy's office. He built the longest bridge in Canada. So we had like a massive construction background. We had people on our board of directors from WestJet, which was like the Southwest Airlines of Canada. So he was kind of in pretty big swinger in certain business circles. And it was supposed to be a 15-minute meeting. We ended up talking for like 2 hours. So it was kind of just like mapping things out. So he kind of took me under his wing, and I was whatever I was at that time, 22, 23. And I got kind of a front row seat to what it's like to build a company. So I was basically, you know, manager of global marketing, which was way above what I should have been able to do. I was flying around the world, setting up kind of partnerships and stuff like that. But my boss at the time was based in Texas. And so I was like, you know what? My girlfriend at the time is in Texas. You know, I'm traveling 100,000 miles a year anyway. Like I'm not even at the office. Can I move out there? So I was kind of given permission to move down to Texas. So I literally took a hockey bag and a duffel bag down to Texas, and the rest is history. I spent 14 years there and been in the US ever since.
So where did you go from there? So what age are we looking at? We're around 1920. Are we still?
Yeah. So college, I think I was done college 23-ish. So I think like 23, 24 is when I sold pest control. And then I probably spent, I don't know, 4 or 5 years at that company that kind of ultimately took me down to Texas. So I was probably like late 20s at that point when I wrapped up that job.
Right. So did you need any side gig? I mean, if you don't mind me asking, so I can set the stage. How old are you now?
I am 39 now.
Right. So you're 39. So we're going back. So we're into the final decade or so. So what about entrepreneurship? Did you try and start and foul at any businesses whilst in the day job at these companies?
Yeah, so I ended up kind of moving into some other energy companies based in Houston, Texas. And again, kind of going back to like, you know, you look at the threads, like the Al Wingenbach stuff, my dad saying, I wish I would have started a company. And then, talking to that dude that kind of ran that kind of that company to go public, and like all these different threads, my buddies and I were just like, man, this isn't for us. Like, I think we realized pretty early on, like, corporate life is kind of bullshit. You kind of try to not listen to that voice because it's not what you're supposed to do, but it doesn't feel right. So corporate life never felt right to me. So 2009 was my first like full foray into it. I started a hockey apparel company called Grinder Threads. So I was always the kind of player, a grinder in hockey is somebody that doesn't have the talents and skills to score, but they can hit and they're gritty and like, they'll chuck a punch at your face if you do the wrong thing. So that was kind of the kind of player I was. So I started this hockey apparel brand called Grinder Threads. And this is Shopify early days, right? Like Shopify was around, but not many people knew about it. So I basically created this kind of hockey apparel brand, Grinder Threads, in 2009. This is before ads. I didn't know much about building anything, but I put up this site. And so that was probably my first foray into like, hey, e-commerce, how do you build stuff, kind of early days. It was nothing special. Again, I didn't know anything about ads. I basically like marketed it based on like Twitter and just word of mouth stuff and forums and stuff. But I think we did like 15, 20 grand a year, something like that. I shipped all the stuff out of my house. I learned that apparel is a really shitty business to be in because of all the sizes. It's just like, and then you got to order 3,000 and you only need large shirts. So it's like, anyway, it was a total mess, but learned a lot. And like, again, I would say like not many people knew how to build a website back then, but I kind of built up an e-commerce site and kind of did it. So that was probably my first like inkling of doing something full on my own.
Yeah. So 29, 30, where were you at then? So you'd already done 5 years in the previous company and corporate.
I think the next, I kind of want to say the next like 5 to 7 years, I kind of call them the lost years. It's not that I didn't do stuff, but it was kind of like, I didn't really have a vehicle to channel my inspiration. So I kind of just put my head down and kind of did the corporate thing for a while. So I bounced around to a couple companies, but ultimately the last stop I had, I was basically the youngest. So I worked my way up to the executive level, right? I was always pretty good. Again, from that experience, kind of coming right out of college, I was put in a position that I should not have been in, but it helped me grow and probably leapfrog my talents and experience. But then the next couple stops, I basically became a director at some of these energy companies. So in the US, there's basically 13 states that are deregulated for energy. So you can buy electricity from anybody. Actually, I worked at one time for a company called Direct Energy, which was owned by Centrica, who owns British Gas, just for context. But I was the last stop I was in was a company called NRG Energy, which is a Fortune 300 company. Yeah. And I think I was 32 when I went over there, and I kind of self-proclaiming this, but I think I was the youngest director there at 32. And then that next stretch was literally kind of like 7 or 8 years just in the retail energy space. I ultimately, on the back half of that, we kind of had like I kind of discovered a Thrasio-like model in the electricity industry where, you have, I think we had a couple million customers. We were basically signing up 30,000 customers a month and losing 30,000. That was kind of the math. So it was like, we were treading water. And like, you have all these smart people and marketing agencies. It's like, well, how do we get more customers and like all this shit? And it always worked out that we would churn as many as we'd gain. And then, so I was like, you know what, like in the state of Texas, there's like 70 electricity companies. Anybody can start one, really. I'm like, why don't we just start buying these things up and sucking them in? So they're just like, all right, Adam, if you can pull it off, you can pull it off. So over the next 2 years, I basically went and I just was like cold calling, again, going back to the door knocking days. I was cold calling all these owners of these electricity businesses, being like, hey, I'm NRG Energy. We want to buy you. We ended up doing 4 or 5 deals. The first one was stupid. I think that we made our money back in 3 months because we would take these electricity companies, we would skin them, put them into our kind of infrastructure. They didn't know how to hedge electricity and all this commodity stuff. And we would just, it was stupid the amount of money we were making. So anyway, so we ended up buying like 4 or 5 companies. That was like 2 years. And then around this time, I don't know if it's like this in the UK, but like no one gives a crap about their energy. It's like a bill. It's like, as long as the lights stay on, like, but if the lights are off, I care. But
it's like in our industry, currency companies, they'll tell you all day long about their customer service, but no one gives a fuck. Is that how low is the rates?
Yeah. Not only do they not give a fuck, but it's actually it's even worse than that. It's like, I actually dislike it. Like, this is something I don't want to do. I have to do this because I gotta have lights. So that's the like sentiment of customers in the energy space. So I think it was like probably like, I don't know, I want to say it was like 14, something like that. But Nest thermostat, they ended up getting purchased by Google. But these guys that worked at Apple created the smart thermostat. So we ended up doing a deal with them where we basically, if somebody signed up for a 2-year electricity contract, we would give them this Nest thermostat. And people went freaking bonkers. I think we sold like 70,000 plans that year just with the Nest thermostat. And for the first time ever, customers.
The Nest guy is Tony Fadell, who
created
the original iPod.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was a cool experience. I got to meet with those guys in the team, and they're fascinating guys. But anyway, so we did that deal, and then of course the executives are like, well, shit, this is the first time anybody's ever liked us. Not that they liked us, but they kind of liked us. It was like the first time that you actually got a little bit excited about signing up for electricity. So then it was on. They're like, there's something here with this like visceral physical product. Let's go find a physical products brand. So a group of us, I wasn't directly involved in this acquisition per se, but group of folks were okay, let's go find the next one. We ended up buying a company out of Utah called Goal Zero. And so rewinding back 4 or 5 years ago, they did a lot of portable batteries, portable solar, a lot in the outdoor kind of adventure space, but some of it correlated to home. But it was this concept of like powering you on the go, like an outlet that could go with you. And so anyway, so people got a hard on for it, and we're like, hey, let's do this. We ended up buying Goal Zero. Around this time again, I had a successful career there, was doing a lot of stuff. I ran at that point a division, like an innovation division, where we were doing a bunch of like skunk work projects. I had a team of like 20 people underneath me, and they're like, but I was kind of had the itch, right? I don't have kids. At that time I was biking a lot, and like Utah is a mecca for biking. So my boss at the time was the one that ended up going over to be the CEO of Goal Zero. He was running like $1 billion EBITDA division at NRG. And he's like, he was kind of done with corporate life. He's like, I'm going to go move to the mountains of Utah and run this business, which was kind of fledgling. And I was kind of going out there every 3-4 months for some various projects. And I kind of just, on one of the visits, I told him, I'm like, hey, Bill, like, I'm kind of like ready. I'm like, it's not urgent, but like, I can't see myself doing this thing in Texas for that much longer. If something ever comes up, just tap me on the shoulder. And it was like 2 months later, he tapped me on the shoulder. He's like, hey, Adam, this is probably like totally outside of your wheelhouse. He's like, but our brand is really good. Our product's really good, but like no one knows their way around a spreadsheet. They don't understand business. Our supply chain's a mess. Our operations are a mess. He's like, I want you to kind of come be my number 2, be head of operations, head of supply chain, and move out to Utah. So I was like, okay, awesome. Move out to Utah, like all the things I want. But up there with accounting, like doing like supply chain and operations was like on my on the bottom of my list for things I would ever want to do. I was managing a business unit in Texas. Always did like a bunch of marketing, business development stuff. I'm like, I don't know, operations. But long story short, the opportunity to move to Utah, I'm like, let's do this. So I moved out to Utah, and then that'll probably get into the next chapter, which kind of bleeds into the Amazon story.
Yeah, let's go there then. We're about 30 minutes in. We've got your early life. Let's talk Amazon. There's a lot of interesting stuff to cover in the next 30 minutes with exits and how you've dealt with that, which will show part of how you've developed to where you are now. I won't spoil the story, but you went out and you played the aggregator system and won. But we'll get into that part later. But how did you get into Amazon?
Yeah, so I kind of moved out to Utah. My first 3 weeks on the job, I basically went to China. So our supply chain was a mess. I think we had 17 factories at the time. So I went out to China for 3 weeks, never done physical products, never done anything in this space other than I guess the Grinder Threads hockey apparel thing, but that was all stateside. So I did like the China whirlwind tour for 3 weeks, kind of like really wrangled our factories and kind of got to meet all the guys there. But when you acquire a business, it's like, you've got this business case that you like project out, right? And if you don't hit that business case, you flubbed the investment. So we were turning over every rock. We're like, hey, and we kind of overpaid a little bit for the business, if I'm honest. So we were kind of turning over every rock. The business was losing about 10 million when we bought it. And one of the rocks I happened to turn over was Amazon. So we were looking at all the channels. Costco was a bit of a mess too. We were just kind of looking at all of them. I'm like, but Amazon was the one channel that was like growing and like hyper profitable. I think they were doing like 3 or 4 million or something like that at that time on Amazon. But they were 1P. So I don't know, not many private label sellers know much about 1P, but if you're like
stay away.
Yeah, exactly. It's a mess. So if you're a traditional retailer, if you're traditionally like sold into brick and mortar retail, somebody from Amazon will reach out and be like, hey, we want to like load you into the Amazon channel. And then you get a manager, and then they basically cut you a PO every week, much like you would with a brick and mortar retail. But you don't manage it at all. All you got to do is ship in the stuff and Amazon sells it for you. The problem is it's like half the margins or even worse in some cases. And so I kind of discovered 3P. I'm like, well, shit, even if we kept the 3 million the same, if we flip this thing over to 3P, we could double the margins. And like, as long as we don't flub that, like that's an easy win for us. And we might be able to grow it. And that kind of started the obsession for me on Amazon. I kind of discovered the bottom of YouTube, but the video that I watched, which had a big impact on me on kind of multiple facets, was the Ryan Daniel Moran at this time. This was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years.
The 2015, really? 16 period. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was like the 0 to million story. And I'm like, holy shit. So I kind of, if you kind of realize my situation at this point, I kind of always had this like entrepreneurial ghost in the back of my mind. Like, you got to do, like, this isn't the life you were meant to live. And I think a lot of people face this too. Like, things are 75% good. And most people just accept that. And they kind of, you know, I've got a good wife. I've got a good life. I'm like executive of this company. I'm living like most people would fucking kill for this life. Yeah. Like, why? Don't be a greedy asshole, right? But in the back of my mind, something wasn't right. And so I was like, I just got back from my trip to China. We just started to move over Amazon on Goal Zero. And I was kind of discovering some of the mechanics of how that kind of plays out. And then I saw this video. I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. Like, this is the time, Adam. Let's take some money. You've got the skills. You now know how to deal with China. You now understand physical products. Like, you've got the money. Like, you don't have kids to worry about. Like, what are you waiting for? And that's when I did it, man. And they're just like, the rest is history. And so that was about 3 years ago when I decided to kind of go for it. And yeah.
And when you said go for it, because you had a war chest of money put aside and some technical chops, especially dealing with China, how fast did you ramp up? Because obviously you'd done an exit earlier on this year, didn't you? So let's walk through the timelines of launch to exit. Yeah.
So it was like, I think about 4 years ago when I moved out to Utah and kind of first started getting into that, and then kind of started digging in on the Goal Zero business. So it's kind of funny. I always say that my first Amazon experience was walking into a $3 million business. So like, I hadn't even done a shipment before. Like, I understood Amazon through kind of taking Goal Zero through that. And we took it to 8 figures on Amazon, but it was I would say it took me about probably 7 months from like watching that video to actually shipping a product in. So it's, you know, you do the research, you kind of discover, it takes back and forth, you decide to order a product. So I think it was about a 7-8 month period. The first product was a failure on that brand. But it was basically June.
What did you do to not make it fail, but what happened and what did you learn from that failure?
Good question. Yeah. So I think for me, this is like any failure I have in Amazon products, it goes back to this question, which is, why would the customer buy it? And I think a lot of times you discover a product idea, you start to order samples, you kind of dedicate, 6 weeks to kind of evaluating it. And then I played a lot of poker actually too, which we probably won't touch on, but like there's something called pot committed in poker, which is like you put enough chips in that you're just like, well, screw it. I've already got enough chips in there, but you probably should walk away. The mathematical decision is to walk away. But I kind of followed a product. I ordered samples and I knew that so it was an umbrella stand and I knew the thing was kind of weird. It was a little too small, but it was modern. But I'm like, this thing's a little small. But I'm like, but it's cheaper to ship. It's cheaper to order. Like it'll be okay. But like, sure enough, the thing was too damn small and customers didn't like it. But it's like I think you tell yourself this story when you're creating products and you get pot committed in the product where you're like, well, I'm this far anyway. Let's just do it.
Well, people do it all the time saying, oh, well, suddenly it's become a premium product. Therefore I charge higher amount of money because they got their numbers wrong and they're committed on the pot, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. So it was just a simple thing of this, like, dude, like, you know exactly why this thing shouldn't have been launched in the first place, but you did it anyway. So it was one of those. So the first product was a failure, but then the next product that kind of ended up being the Hero Asin, and like the rest is history for that home goods brand. But I formally launched that in like April or May of 2019. So it was a little north of 2 years from like starting that brand to exiting for 7 figures.
Cool. So let's walk through some of this. Like, I mean, you've got the YouTube channel now. What made you get started with that? And what are some of the things? Because YouTube can be a tough place in terms of starting the channel. There's tons of channels on there. And what I like about you, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to others, but most of the content on YouTube around FBA is just the content's kind of, it's weak and it's more salesy and stuff like that. But it's almost like what you do on YouTube is like the grown-up version. if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you know
Yeah, and
what I
that
mean?
was
Because of the
a little bit
content
of
that
the
you talk about. It's
yeah,
not, hey, FBA and a
yeah,
smile and a dance around. And so, I know I'm a miserable cunt, but
yeah.
it's just
I
like,
am too.
but it was like, that's what your content resonated with me, because it was just like, this is how it is. And you just lay it out. Do you know what I mean? It's not
Yeah.
like a lot of that stuff is like overproduced and it's about the thumbnail, but the substance is quite poor, or it's about affiliates and everything else,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the thesis on that was, again, I'd kind of found success with my Amazon brands and kind of had a front row seat. At the time too, we were scaling that business into 9 figures that we bought.
Yeah.
So I kind of had that experience that was non-Amazon too.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, you know what, man, I got something to say on this. Like, and I felt like this was also COVID was kind of going on. And so I was kind of bored and I couldn't do anything else. I mean, I was out riding my bike or whatever, but I was like locked in the house. I'm like, you know what? And what frustrated me is I'd bought courses and gotten value out of courses as well throughout the thing. But it was this whole, like you talked about, right? You got to play the game a little bit. You know this too. Like you got to play the game a little bit to get the algos going and all that. But like it was all this flashy bullshit from people that I didn't feel like had substantive information. And their only motivation, even though they weren't explicit about it, like they were trying to be a little bit nefarious about it, was to sell you something. And there was always everybody always had a fucking angle. And like I was just like, you know what? I've got something to say. I think it's a different perspective than most people have seen. I've got a more, and I think a lot of the people, and this isn't a knock on this era at all, but a lot of the original era of Amazon was like your eBay sellers, you're kind of like e-com hustlers. Then they got into Amazon early and like they first
then
movers there.
crypto, they just moved from
whatever.
one
Like,
to another.
that was kind of the thread of successful people, or a lot of the successful people on the YouTube space. So I was just like, you know what? I actually come from a pretty professional background. I don't think many people have done that transition. I played with some big chips at the table with some big boys. Like I understand how that world works. I'm like, and I've got a different perspective. So I'm like, you know what? Let's do a video a week. Let's not sell one damn thing. Let's reveal everything but brand names and products. Like let's reveal everything that anybody would reveal selling a $3,000 course and just put it out there and see what happens. That was literally my motivation. Yeah. I'd also read a Twitter thread at the time. I don't know if you know Naval Ravikant.
I love Naval, yeah.
Yeah. So like I read his thread and I was just like, I couldn't code. Anyway, long story short, he's got this thread, How to Be Rich. I think it's something like that. But he's kind of
the art of getting rich. Me and Leland we covered it last year. Peak COVID.
Oh, did you? Cool.
We broke down a lot of that stuff and the meanings behind a lot of his quotes.
Cool. But one thing that I realized, I couldn't code and stuff, but I'm like, you know what? I've done presentations my whole life. Like this is like, I've been in boardrooms. Like I know how to have a conversation, know how to do decks. I'm like, one thing I can do is I can articulate ideas. And I'm like, I'm not a coder, but I can do the media stuff. So I'm like, let's see if I could figure out this leverage stuff. And I totally underestimated, you know this well too, like the power of leverage with media. It's mind boggling. So that was kind of it, man. I had this, like, I was bored. Felt like I had something to say. I didn't like what was being said by the majority of people out there. I felt like I had a different angle. And I'm like, let's just disrupt this space and just be like, fuck it. Let's just go for it. Do a video a week, reveal it all and see if people like it. And I think the rest is history on that front too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people look for certain motivations. Like even now people are going, where's the catch? It's like 750 podcasts in. Of course, I've got the ladies on board there. They're contributing one a week, but it's what I do. Do you see what I mean?
Yep.
Like, because people, and I think as well with content, it's a compound. Right?
100%.
The more you do it, the more you develop, and over that period of time, it has like a compounded loads. And it's like, where's the fucking leads? Do you know what I mean? Because there's too much focus. And then what happens is they start selling and it becomes more, and it'll be like code and it'll be this. And then it's just all about that. I mean, I listened to a podcast. I stopped listening to, I won't name who it was. They done a podcast. It was an Amazon podcast. It was an hour long and it was talking about getting straight to the point. And they spent 23 minutes and 34 seconds chatting shit before they got to the point. And that was the irony of that whole thing. Like for me, content comes first. Nothing more important than the content. Everything else will just fit around it and the cards will fall where they will fall. Content first. That's it. Content first, respect your audience, consistency. Done.
Well, I think
no one wants to do that because it's it's work.
And I kind of like, it's the field of dreams analogy for me, right? You build it and they will come.
Yeah.
And I think the difference is that if you come in with the intention of monetizing of some like selfish outcome, and first of all, those people are typically short-sighted. So that kind of plays into the thesis of failure anyway, but they come in with an intention. And I think what was different for me, and it's a real big life lesson with the YouTube stuff, which is I literally had no intention. I knew that I could potentially build a course and that actually will come. I could have stuff that came out. Like I knew that there was a possible monetization, thing that came, but that wasn't my intention. My intention was to come in, throw some haymakers, drop a video a week, and just see what the hell would happen. And I believed that if I did that, something would happen, but I wasn't doing it because of that thing. And I think you mentioned another thing that I think is super important, which is people come in and they're like, okay, well, I did 4 videos over the last 2 months. Like, why don't I have 20,000 subs yet? Yeah. And the growth curve is like, it's like flat for a really, really long time with leverage. And then all of a sudden, it's like exponential. And so I think that when you focus on leverage activities and those things, it takes time, but then when it does swing the other way, it's more powerful than you could ever imagine. And I think that's with life, building a business, everything. It's like you put in those hard yards, and you got to go deeper in the swimming pool than any other motherfucker can go. You got to be hard, but I'll tell you what, you get rewarded disproportionately on the backside of that if you can push through the chasm.
Yeah. No, I mean, when half the industry comes to me when they're launching a podcast, what to do, I just lay it all out to them. And I went, throw away the first 100 episodes because you're going to be shit.
Yeah.
Just put it out there. By year 2, if you haven't done it, can it? If you haven't got anywhere by year 2, but just consistency, good quality content, don't sell anything. That's it.
Exactly. And I think people can smell authenticity too. I think there's other people out there that play and honestly, that's one of the sad commentaries I think about the Amazon space is there's probably more people I don't like than there are that I like, which is kind of sad because they're not honest about the angle. If I'm going to sell you something, I'll tell you I'm selling you something. Yeah. And the reason you will buy it is because I have built up a war chest of trust. I've given 10 times, asked once. But there's all these people that not only do they ask 10 times, give once, but they also don't tell you when they're asking. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like they do it in the manipulation. Yeah. Like, and it's hard to see, but you can read between the lines on what their real intentions are. And I think authenticity is a layer that's critically important as part of that layer cake.
I'm a big believer. You don't listen to a damn thing that someone says. Watch their actions. Eventually, people will tell on themselves. If you watch someone's actions, believe them. That's the bit that, it's like chatting shit is just nonsense. Put your head down, do the work, and let your work speak for yourself.
Yeah. 100%.
All right. So off my soapbox, because this is about you. So let's go back to, we kind of jumped around a little bit, but I really want to get into, I know you covered it a bit on Sharon's show. That experience that you've gained and getting to C-suite level and everything else has led to the fact that you went and played the aggregator game. Explain the story there, because you managed the whole exit process yourself, didn't you? You just went out and done it for yourself. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah, 100%. So at this point, I had 3 of my own Amazon brands I started from scratch. I was involved in some other ones. I've still been working the executive job during this whole time. So I, kind of crimped for time, and I had the YouTube stuff going on. So I was like, you know what? It's time to take some chips off the table, can quit the executive day job, go kind of full into these other brands that I was more passionate about. So I'm like, I'm going to sell. So I'd kind of like, I was sitting on my patio one Sunday. I just threw on a Pearl Jam playlist, one of my favorite bands. And I'm just like, I'm just going to look at selling this thing. I've been coming from an M&A business background, I was super fascinated about the aggregator space. I was actually looking at becoming involved in it in some facet before the industry just got kind of stupid. But then, so when it started getting really like there was 60 people, I'm like, you know what? I don't want to partake in that. But I knew who they were. So I kind of compiled this list. I ended up reaching out to, I think it was like 40 or 50 of them, just like a factory, messaged them, emailed them. Here's my brand. Here's my business. Here's the financials. If you're interested, let's talk. So that Sunday turned into the next 2-week whirlwind, which was like really understanding the aggregator space. So I ended up having, I think it was like 25 meetings I had with aggregators across all different sizes and shapes. Some of them multiple meetings. That turned into 6 offers, which kind of whittled down to 3 that was kind of in the bidding war stage, and I ultimately sold. So in that 2-week period from reaching out to all these guys to getting kind of an offer that made sense, it was about a 2-week kind of stint. But ask me any questions you want there, man. But it was a wild 2 weeks.
That's impressive. So you were under LOR within 2 weeks of the first email went out.
Yep.
even multiple meetings. So you're working night and day. And how did you flesh that out to weigh off the deals? Because it's quite complex to see what the offers are, right? So how did
Yep.
you manage to not split test, but because it's not an apples to apples comparison each time because of the nature of the offers. How
Yep.
were you able to weigh up that and start to clear, through they're no good, move them to the B list, they're no good, move them to the C list? You know what I mean? How
Yep.
did you do the whittle down process?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously a qualitative and a quantitative process to anything in business. Frankly, if it involves people, it's definitely going to be qualitative as well. But I basically just looked at it in a couple fronts. Obviously, offer is be all end all, right? Like, is the math where within your shot? There was some that just like the offer wasn't there, like they're just so far off. There's no way we could kind of find a middle ground. So some of it was financial, and that was kind of the first wave. But the more subtle wave that I think is super, super important when you're exiting a business is the alignment piece. And I would just say, your people, right? Like, that if we were in a pub, we'd be in there we'd close it down until 3 a.m. talking shop. Like, that's just kind of like, you kind of just sense your people. And you also sense the people that you'd have a tough time spending 20 minutes with. That's the same thing when you're exiting a business, right? So you talk with all these people, that like there's the Goldman Sachs types that, just didn't know their head from their ass. There's the people that just, you could tell weren't experienced enough to kind of transition a deal. There's some people you just didn't like them, Now, if the money was like way there, then that might overshoot it in a business deal. But if the money's kind of the net average, then it becomes about some of those other alignment attributes. And so some of them I just disqualified because I'm like, there's no way in hell that I can trust these guys during due diligence, or that I could see myself working with them for 6 weeks in the trenches and coming out the other side without something happening. So some of them were kind of skirted that way. But the final three were I was well aligned with all three of them. Some a little bit more than others, but it really kind of came down to some of the structure and the math with those final three.
Saying that, you seem like a good judge of character. Did you look at some of the you mentioned you don't mention any names or anything, of course, but did you get to the stage when you're like, they're a scumbag, they're unethical? Did you see some of the dark, shady shit that could go on, but you were wise to it?
No, and I've heard of that happening. For me, it wasn't any like dark, like unethical stuff. It was just like, you could just tell that it was more that just people didn't know what they didn't know.
Right.
And I'm like, you know what? I don't want to, like, I'll give you an example, right? So one of the questions that I asked before I kind of got into the finalists was, I want to know explicitly what would change your offer and the math of your offer if we were in due diligence, post LOI. What are the explicit things that you would change? Because I've heard of people getting like their offers rescinded because they didn't have a trademark in Canada, which they don't need, or they like, they've reduced offers 30%. I wanted to absolutely avoid any of the offers.
That's normally because they want to get you off the street, right?
Exactly. So, they isolate you
under LOR.
Exactly.
It normally comes down to because of the lack of due diligence, so they can take you away. If they need deal flow and they're going up against, say, a Frasio and the big guys, getting you off the table quick and then chunking down on terms of your offer.
And then it's a 30% reduced offer when you get to, and they play on decision fatigue because you're exhausted. It's a long process. You don't want to go back to the drawing board. So I wanted to avoid that. So like, I'll give you an example. One of the folks that I kind of asked that question to, and most of them are like the answer you want to hear: if we uncover fraud, if we uncover a commercial invoice where your COGS are different, like any of that's going to change our math. But other than that, it's not going to change. But some of these guys were just like, well, we got to like really dig into Q4 because you had a lot of volume in Q4 and just kind of see what that's like. It's like, dude, you guys have the income statements. Or like, we want to dig in and just see if anything's happened to the account. You guys have had access to the account for 2 weeks or a week or whatever. Like, what's in the health metrics. I've shared everything that's ever happened to any ASIN. Like, that information now. And so I think there was just some people that you could just tell that either didn't know what they didn't know, or they left some very concerning questions as to what would happen during the due diligence period. And for me, I actually walked away from a couple $100,000 for that reason, because I was just like, you know what, I'd rather lose a couple $100,000 but have a lot more certainty and be aligned with the people I'm going into the trenches with. Because you are going into the trenches. It's almost like a marriage for 6 weeks where you're highly linked with whoever you're kind of going into that due diligence period with. So
the cash hits the bank. What's the reaction?
Man, it was funny. So like, surreal is probably the biggest kind of thing. So I was actually going to an Amazon event. This is like the first like post-COVID time I'd been in an airport. So it was kind of weird even then. Like the senses were like, oh wow, what is this? I'm in an airport. But I was like flicking my like app every kind of 10 minutes because I knew the wire was supposed to come through that morning. And it's a freaking intense experience for 6 weeks. Like you just never know. I'm just like, is this going to be when Amazon does something stupid? Like, you know that it's unlikely, but you're a little bit on pins and needles this entire time. And I wasn't going to take a breath until the money was in the bank.
Yeah.
And then one of those flicks, it was literally just an extra. I mean, you go from 6 figures to 7 figures in an account. It's surreal. Like you're looking down at it. It's kind of like, damn. And like you go through, for me, I kind of spent a couple of minutes like thinking through all the gauntlet that you go through to build that business. So I had all those memories. I kind of think back to my childhood experiences. And so you kind of have this like euphoric kind of emotional experience. But then it's funny, man. Like you kind of think it's going to continue and you're going to be like on cloud 9 or whatever else. But then it was like 15 minutes later, it's like, okay, checking in, whatever. And then you get on an airplane and then it kind of felt like normal life after that first 10 minutes. But it was surreal when it first happened.
Yeah, do you know, because I've interviewed a load of people that have exited, and one of the most common things I hear is like, yeah, you know, we exit exhausted, didn't really celebrate, maybe have a glass of wine, whatever, right? But the panic sets in is like, there's no regular income and they don't want to touch the principal. Then the panic is, which is an amazing panic to have, we've got all this money, but we don't really want to spend it on monthly living costs because they don't have the revenue coming to pay themselves. Right.
Yeah.
So then the panic starts. He's like, right, better go and buy some property and stuff. But it's a lovely panic to have.
Yeah.
So what did you do? Did you already have existing brands that were generating revenue, or did you have any third-party revenue streams outside of the sale itself?
Yeah. So for me, part of the reason I sold was I had other stuff to focus on. I don't think I would have sold if it was my only brand, honestly. I probably would have kept at it. So I had the other brands. So I was just kind of like, okay, now I can really, really focus on the other brands, especially the ones that there's one in particular I'm super passionate about. So for me, it was kind of like a relief, honestly. I didn't have that fear of like not having anything to do anymore. I had plenty to do. So for me, and I had money and all that stuff. So I wasn't really concerned about that at all. So I didn't have that particular thing, but I think it was because I've been planning this for a long time. Again, part of why I got into this was this couple-year plan to get out of the corporate world. It's part of why I had the YouTube stuff. I knew that I had leverage through YouTube at that point, and it kind of put in hard yards there. So I didn't have that gap, but probably because I had other things kind of going on that I'd planned behind the scenes in advance.
Cool. So ending it up, last few questions. Darkest hour just before dawn. It's been your darkest moment, life, business, biggest comeback kind of thing.
Yeah, I'll maybe kind of use an Amazon analogy. I've got some other life ones too, but I'll maybe use an Amazon one. So I had this particular brand I sold. There was a Hero Ace, and this is why like people think that it's all like rainbows when it's not. So in August this is last Q4. In August, I placed a massive PO, an uncomfortable PO, and I think that's what people don't realize. That if you're going to do a couple million in sales, that means that you've got to have 600 grand in inventory. Like that's not fun. So I kind of did this big order for Q4. I had also had a legal dispute with a major US retailer on my trademark. So I actually had to sell through this inventory by February because I had to change the brand name. They basically paid me to abandon the trademark, which I had to abandon in February. So I had one last Q4 with this brand name, had a big PO placed. And then October, my ASIN goes down. I have no idea still to this day exactly what it was, but it was down for about 2 weeks. I think it was down for. And this was like, you try all the different POAs, all the stuff, and nothing was working. And I'm sitting here, the stuff had just started to arrive at the dock. I'm like, I'm screwed. If I can't get this fixed, I'm screwed. I miss out on Q4. I've got this inventory that's branded, a brand that I can't have after February. So long story short, I ended up coming out the other side of that. We ended up getting it back. I actually had to call in some favors with a guy that I worked with at NRG that was working at Amazon. He's the one that helped me kind of get it back. But anyway, that was probably the realest moment for me in the Amazon business, because it was just like the world was collapsing around me. I literally would have been screwed. Yeah. And we probably wouldn't be having this conversation about the exit if that didn't happen. And then fast forward, we ended up doing, I think it was like 700 or 800 grand with that SKU in 4 weeks. So
cool. Legacy on money.
For me, legacy, man. I mean, I've always been a person that if my bills are paid, money's nice, but it's not, for me, it's freedom, health, relationships. in life that matter. The money just helps lubricate all those things, so to speak. But yeah, man, it's about what you do in life and the people you impact and the friends and connections you make and the experiences that you have.
How would you like to be remembered?
Oh man, that's a good one. I think what I'd like to be remembered as is like Adam was always real. He wasn't always right. He wasn't always. He could have been a dick sometimes. Like he wasn't always perfect. But you know what? He always played the game with his cards face up. He always did right by people, and he always had the best of intentions with those that were in his circle.
That's your in depth. How do you feel?
What's that?
That's your in depth. How do you feel?
It was. This is probably one of the more interesting ones. Honestly, I haven't thought about that stuff. I don't, dude. 25 years, some of that stuff that we just talked about. It's kind of weird the reserves of memory that you have. So I enjoyed it, man. Thanks for eking some of that stuff out. I hadn't thought about it in a long time, and honestly, I hadn't even pieced it together in terms of how it kind of played into where I'm at now in life. So it was fun, man.
That whole corporate thing, the China, the management, the C-level. This is why you were able to do exits, because of the experience that you gained. So all of those years in corporate, like you said, lost in the wilderness and everything else. Most people will take longer to get to that stage of exit, but it's almost like you compressed everything in 3 years. So you overachieved in corporate with your age. Then you spent way too long in corporate for most entrepreneurs. And then you fucking killed it in 3 years. Yeah. Because you used that first part of your life to be able to extract that in 3 year period.
No, man, I 100% agree that like good, bad, and different, the things that happen to you in life or for you in life cultivate into the reason that you're where you're at. And it doesn't feel like it sometimes when you're in the trenches and when the shit's hitting the fan.
Yeah.
But everything happens for a reason, and it stacks itself up for a reason. So yeah, I fundamentally agree with that.
Cool. So thanks for joining us today. What's the best way that people can reach you?
Simple. Just go type in Adam Heist on YouTube. You'll find me there. I drop a video a week and try to kind of, again, go deeper than most and try to kind of cover angles that I think a lot of people don't chat about in the space. So yeah, man, if you want free content on a weekly basis, go to Adam Heist on YouTube.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Join us today. I'll be back here tomorrow, 4 p.m. BST. Take care of yourself and your family. Much love, and I'll see you then.